Welcome to our webinar on the frequent flying levy in Europe. I'm Magdalena Heuwieser. I'm a co-founder and campaigner at the Stay Grounded Network. 3 weeks ago, we published new research on the frequent flying levy in Europe, together with the New Economics Foundation and Ecologistas en Acción from Spain, together with our French network Restés sur Terre, the UK charity Possible, Bond Beta Leaf Milieu from Belgium, 2 degrees Celsius from Romania, and New Weather Institute from Sweden. Until then, there was research on the FFL, which is the short abbreviation of Frequent Flying Levy, for the UK, and also one paper for the international level by the ICCT. But what was lacking was a European picture, as well as the big question, will it actually work? What could be legal, political obstacles, and how could they be overcome? We had long discussions on the topic inside our network and with the partners on how a frequent flying levy could be shaped in the most effective and fair way, and how the revenues could be used. We had several feedback loops with different stakeholders on these questions. We commissioned both CE Delft to do an economic feasibility study and Addestone Law to do a legal feasibility study. We then summarized the results and also added some more analysis from the More in Common polling led by ECF, which was then the civil society report we launched in October, which you might have already seen. So this is now one proposal for an FFL, and it's clear that it is one proposal, and that in order to get this implemented, the exact shape will of course need more discussions. And today's webinar is also one of those where we will be able to discuss our outcomes. So next slide, please. Today I will give you a short background on why we think a frequent flying levy makes sense. Then Alex Chapman from the New Economics Foundation will present the results of the research. Alex is a senior economist at NEF and co-produced the Civil Society report. And then I'm very, very thankful for Javier Lavandera to make a comment with his view on the economic context and implementation. He is an economic professor at the University of Vigo. He's also director of the research institution Economics for Energy. I translated the name. He formed part of the IPCC for the 5th and 6th climate evaluations. And he also was a member of the White Book Elaboration Committee for the Spanish tax reform. So thanks for being here with us. After that, we are very open for your questions and comments. There are also some things we'd be interested in discussing with you, or questions that came up after the launch, which you might also be interested in, such as the current political situation on aviation taxes. For example, you might have realized that the kerosene tax exemption in the EU will probably be prolonged for another 20 years. Also, the Swedish government recently announced to scrap their ticket tax completely. There was also a slight rise in the UK's air passenger duty, and in France, a ticket tax raise is being planned. So this is a lot of moving on this topic right now. So I think with this research, we come in at the right timing. And also there might be other interesting discussions, for example, the difference between strong limits or flight contingencies per person versus a progressive tax as we proposed it with this research. Yeah. So there was a comment in the chat on the interpretation. So if you want to hear only English, you should go into the English room on the bottom. So quickly before we go into the topic for those who don't know yet who we are. Next slide, please. So Stay Grounded is a network of more than 200 member organizations. We started off in 2016, and our main goal is to build collective pressure to degrow aviation. Next slide, please. So we focus both on countering false solutions and greenwashing and supporting groups to stop airport expansion. And we also campaign together for fair climate solutions. So climate justice is at the center of what Stay Grounded does. Maybe Alex, you quickly want to also explain about New Economics Foundation?
Hi, everyone. So yeah, I work for the New Economics Foundation, or as we call it, NEF. We were a charitable think tank working on policy issues related to sort of the environment and the economy. And NEF was one of the first organizations, I think, to propose a frequent flyer levy around 10 years ago initially, and we've been working on it continuously since then, including several times succeeding in convincing UK political parties to put it in their manifesto, but sadly never the manifesto of the winning party. So we still have work to do.
Thanks. Yeah, so I would also be interested in who is in this room with us. So if you want, please introduce yourself by just writing into the chat where you're based at, and maybe also one word on your background, like the name of the organization you work for, or the activist group you're affiliated with, or the research entity, so that we have a picture of who's in the room. And yeah, I would start now with the aviation context, why we think a frequent flying levy is important. So we think that the frequent flying levy can support the green transition in 3 ways. First, to cut emissions in the short to medium term, while the current dominant solutions proposed by the industry and politics usually look at the long-term solution with technology that is not there yet and might never come. Second, to protect access to flying for infrequent lower income passengers while still managing overall air traffic levels. So this does not mean that we think that flying should be a human right, but it is, of course, we acknowledge the fact that flying can be necessary in certain circumstances, or that migrants might want to visit their family once in a while, and it would be a big problem if flights were only accessible to very rich people. So that's why, yeah, we think that the FFL could support this. And third, the FFL could also raise significant funds, which are very important right now for accelerating Europe's transition to a fairer, greener economy, and also for supporting nations least responsible for the climate crisis with loss, damage, and adaptation. Next slide, please. Then the context on aviation. I think probably all of you know that aviation emissions are rising again after the COVID pandemic. And we might also all know that technology alone won't solve the issue. Actually, some technology can create new problems, like biofuels and other types of fuel substitutes. So we know that demand management is essential, and we also know that we are totally lacking behind any climate commitments, and we're totally off track anyways. But like, if we were to achieve the Paris Agreement's goals, and if aviation was allowed to grow as it is currently allowed to grow, this would mean that other sectors and communities would need to cut even further, like housing, food, while air traffic is something is mostly a non-essential luxury good. So we do need to also reduce aviation's share of the carbon budget. And in the CE Delft report we commissioned, it was calculated that until 2050, if flights were distributed equally worldwide, we only have 4 short-haul return flights left per person, or 1 long-haul return flight in the next 26 years. Or if we accepted the unequal distribution between the global north and south, then it would be 10 short-haul return flights in Europe, or 3 long-haul return flights per passenger or per person in the next 26 years. We could, of course, also return, like, put this upside down and say there already have been so many flights in Europe in the last decades, we would actually need to cut more than other continents do. So this is a big moral debate, basically, and we had to take quite some moral decisions when commissioning the studies and doing this report. But Alex will talk a bit more about the baselines and assumptions. Next slide, please. Another important fact why we need this FFL is that air traffic is the most unequal mode of transport. So only 1% of the world's population causes 50% of commercial aviation emissions, while more than 80% of the world's population have never set foot on an airplane. And you might have seen the recent report from Oxfam, the Carbon Inequality Kills report, which brings this example that the private jets of 23 super rich individuals emitted an average of 2,000 tons of carbon a year. And this is equivalent to 300 years worth of emissions for the average person in the world, or 2,000 years worth of someone in the global poorest 50%. So we see that, it's really crazy. It's like the pinnacle of climate injustice. Next slide. So this is not only on the global level, but we also see this in Europe and even in Western Europe. So half of people in Western Europe don't take a single flight in a given year, and just 1 out of 10 take 3 or more return flights a year. Next. And we see that this is very much linked to class or income, who flies and who doesn't. So 7 out of 10 of the poorest households in Western Europe don't fly at all in a given year, compared to just 1 out of 5 of the richest. Next. We also see that the richest households in Western Europe are 7 times more likely to be frequent flyers compared to the poorest. We are probably all shocked right now with the outcomes of the US elections. I'm also shocked about, Germany, where I'm based at, where we now basically don't have a working government anymore and will have elections soon, and probably also a more right-wing government. So we currently see a big green backlash due to a lot of reasons. We have this cost of living crisis, we had the COVID pandemic, we have, but we also have climate measures that are highlighted as something unfair, or that are being seen as something unfair, and that even sometimes are unfair or might impact different groups unequally. The European Green Deal promises to leave no one behind, but actually does lack focus on inequality. And we need to address the underlying inequalities to ensure effective and inclusive climate action. So in my ideal world, we would have social policies and systemic changes in our economy and society that abolish extreme wealth and extreme poverty, or also poverty. And if we are more, if there's an equal playing field, then prices can help to nudge environmental behavior. Like, then people can themselves decide if they want to use their money for buying a flight or buying organic food or whatever. But as this is not the case, and as we are working on the field of aviation, we think that aviation-related policies should be as fair and progressive as possible, and also perceived as much as fair as possible. Not only taxes, but also regulations. And so the frequent flying levy is something we see as, we came up with as one of the fairest mechanisms. It's not the only mechanism that will solve everything. We will definitely need other measures alongside, like regulations, for example, banning private jets and other unnecessary, pointless flights, like short-haul flights or night flights, which disturb neighborhoods. Yeah, or capping airport capacity, which also could help problems of over-tourism we are currently facing. So there are different measures that will need to be put in place, but we do see that the FFL would be important to also complement other measures. So that was, I think, all on the context, and I hand on to Alex for the results of the research.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to do my best to summarize some of the key findings from all three of the reports. But obviously, I'm going to try to avoid going into huge amounts of detail and boring people with the, some of the detail of the calculations. A lot of that is in the reports, but I'm happy to take questions on that later if I do skip over anything important. So the first question, of course, in the study was, what is our target? What are we aiming to do? What is this primarily we're talking about a climate policy. So what is it we're trying to achieve in terms of an emissions reduction? CE Delft looked at what they considered to be different versions of a fair aviation carbon budget and what our current trajectory is in terms of consuming that budget. Now, they came up with quite a broad range of potential reduction needs, from 25% reduction to 80%. And the reason there's such a large variation there is because ultimately it's actually a moral judgment as to how aviation's carbon budget is spread across countries and income groups and sectors of the economy. It's hard to decide exactly what is a fair allocation without making some moral judgments. But what in the end we were able to conclude by taking a sort of midpoint of a 45% reduction was really that multiple types of measures would be needed to deal with the aviation carbon problem, and that probably a frequent flyer levy wouldn't be on its own sufficient to get us as far as that. And we are in a climate emergency, so essentially we're going to need to pull every lever we have available. As Lena was explaining earlier, there's those quite shocking figures about how few flights we really have left to consume between now and 2050 if we are really serious about achieving our goals. So we designed a frequent flying levy, and I'd just like to start this section by saying that there are a huge range of opinions about exactly how the levy could look and could be designed. And even amongst our sort of coalition of organizations in this project, we found differences of opinion about what is the fairest way, what is the optimal way of delivering a levy. And our proposal here is not the final answer, but we needed to test something. So what we've done here is we've set up a design of the levy, and we have tested how it might work and what it might do, perhaps just to prove its potential, to prove that it can work, what it could raise in terms of revenues, and what size of emissions cut it could deliver. So the key parameters were that transfer flights in our model were not charged. So if you're traveling to a final destination and you needed to change flights to get there, you'd only be charged once. You wouldn't be charged for the change of flights. But if you were flying outside of the EU, say from Paris to Bangkok, you would pay a double charge on your outbound flight because obviously on the inbound flight you may not pay anything at all. But that would depend on the country that you were, because the tax would depend on the country you were departing from. Thailand would set the departure tax in Bangkok, and the EU or France would set it in Paris. Now, of course, if your return flight was being taxed by another country that, say, even had its own frequent flyer levy or another similar policy, you could remove this double charge because you'd argue that the individual has been taxed fairly, and that's similar to what the EU has just implemented in its carbon border adjustment mechanism. That's saying that everything that passes over the EU border, we will make adjustments to the tax to make sure that it is fairly taxed for climate purposes based on the taxes of the third party, the external country. And why we need to do that, of course, is if we don't make the adjustment at the border, what we would actually be doing is encouraging people to fly outside of Europe because people would be taxed twice for flights inside Europe, but only once for flights outside Europe. So that adjustment is quite important in the model. And as I said, there is a precedent for those types of adjustment already in policy. We then also applied in our main model a distance surcharge so that the frequent flyer levy was actually higher, or there was a higher levy charge if you were going to a longer distance destination. We don't actually want that to be the case because we would much prefer to live in a world where, as well as having a frequent flyer levy, there was a proper kerosene or carbon distance-based tax on aviation leaving Europe. But there isn't right now. In fact, there is, broadly speaking, virtually no tax at all, which would create a price incentive or a price reason to encourage people buying their tickets to fly shorter distances because we know that longer distances are more damaging to the climate. But in our central scenario, because that doesn't exist right now, we've included in the design a distance-based charge. And then we've left it slightly open in terms of what happens to foreign residents who travel into Europe. They could either be brought into the European tax regime, the frequent flying levy, but of course that would be tricky because they wouldn't be getting charged for flights that took place entirely outside of Europe. And also would mean that they would be required to register with an EU agency, although they probably more or less do that already anyway for other immigration or travel reasons. Or they could just be subject to some form of flat departure tax, as some countries already apply, such as where I am here in the UK. But primarily, of course, what we're interested in here is the flying behaviours of European residents, and they, of course, are responsible for the vast majority of flights inside the EU and European area, but also actually a very, very oversized share of flights outside of Europe as well. So that leaves us then with the core and what the frequent flyer levy really does, which is that for your first return flight, you essentially pay no additional departure tax. And then for each additional flight after that, you start to see a rising charge. And here, when I talk about each additional flight, I'm talking essentially about each additional return flight, because the way the model is set up is that it actually increases the charge you pay for every two single flights. So you could take two single flights on two separate trips potentially, and you wouldn't trigger the charge. But then once you took your third single flight, or you took a third and fourth single flight to do, i.e. to do a return, then you would see the first charge kick in at 50 euros for each leg, rising to 100 euros for each leg for your third return flight of the year, and so on, rising beyond that. In our model, and this was again slightly controversial, I think we could say, we decided to replace the existing regime of ticket taxes in some European countries that is already there. So Germany, the Netherlands, the UK have an existing departure tax. Other countries don't. The reason for that is primarily so that we can create a uniform system across Europe, because ultimately, without a uniform system, you'll end up potentially with people finding clever ways to try and trick the system to try and avoid paying their fair charges. We did say, I'll add on that that those countries that currently have a departure tax could still retain some revenue so that when they switch to the frequent flying levy, they wouldn't lose out in some way, but it would replace their current regime. And a couple of extra things that we added on, we increased or put an additional surcharge on flights in what are called the comfort classes, premium, economy, business, and first class. That was set at €100, although I think at least Lena and I felt by the end that it probably should have been higher, but that was the decision that we made at the time for the purposes of the model. Obviously reflecting those flights having a much higher environmental damage per person. And the final thing to say is that what we haven't put on into this design is any charge on non-carbon based emissions. Actually, anyone here who's sort of been following the detail of these debates will know that there's a fairly strong scientific consensus that non-carbon emissions, water vapor and nitrous oxides and the things that come out from the tailpipe of the plane when it's at high altitude may actually be doing more damage to the climate than just the carbon on its own. But at the moment, and that probably should be taxed or at least should be regulated in some way. But at the moment, that's not in this model, and it's something that needs to be addressed separately. So what did this design deliver? And that was, I should have said added as well, was modeled for all European nations. So with this at the headline level, we were able to deliver within, assuming it was implemented in, say, 3-4 years' time, we were able to deliver around a 21% reduction in the emissions from the European aviation sector. And perhaps what we think is one of the greatest strengths to this policy is that actually that emission saving, which is very substantial on the entire aviation sector of Europe, happens with no cost to the majority of European citizens. Of course, partly because many of them are not flying at all, but also some are only taking one short haul flight. And there's a little more detail here on those results. So, of course, the emissions reduction comes from a reduction in passenger numbers. This shows the year 2028, and you can see a 26% reduction in the number of passenger journeys that took place, equivalent to something like 300 million in a year, delivering that 21% reduction in emissions. And at the same time, from that new design of the frequent flyer levy, a very significant increase in tax revenues rising to across all European nations. Seeing there in the baseline scenario on the left of the table, 10 billion would be raised in 2028 from existing departure taxes, ticket taxes. Applying this policy all across Europe could see 74 billion raised. And that's after we account for the fact that there's been a reduction in passenger numbers. That's the revenue that you raise from the remaining passengers. Those impacts can be broken down on a country level. We've only looked at sort of six Western European nations for this analysis, purely because we had better data on those countries. Obviously, we would like to be able to do it for every country, and actually the CE Delft paper, if you want to look at that, does have more information on other countries than just these 6. But you can see fairly consistently across the 6 that we've shown here, similar levels of reduction in emissions. Looking at the top line there for Belgium, you've got a 28% reduction in emissions versus, in some countries, Netherlands only a 12%. And these changes we see here reflect the sort of nature of the aviation market in those countries. For example, how many frequent flyers there are in those countries, but also a critical factor is whether those countries have transfer flights or just departure flights. Netherlands, for example, is a country with many, many transfer flights going through Schiphol Airport, and that impacts the way that aviation dynamics change in the Netherlands. And on the right-hand side, you can see very significant revenues being raised at the country level there. Several billion in most cases. Looking at my country, the United Kingdom, 9 billion potentially raised there, very significant increase. And of course, potentially that could be collected at a European level, or if this policy was implemented just by a group of European nations, say these 6 in Western Europe, that could be revenue that the governments themselves could collect. I suppose the key messages, of course, of this policy is that we do all of this whilst affecting only a very small subset of the European population. So To put numbers on that, you see in this infographic here that around 54% of the overall reduction in flying that I've just shown comes from just under 5% of the population. So it's only really 5% who are really going to feel this in a material way on their everyday behavior in their wallets. 72% of the population are paying no frequent flying charges. Some of them might end up paying a little bit of an extra charge on their distance. As I mentioned earlier, we are proposing to charge for longer haul flights. But in terms of the frequent flying levy, which affects you when you take more than one flight per year, 72% don't see any change at all. And on the right-hand side, you can see how that's spread across different levels of household income. Um, so you see just 15% of households in the bottom income group, so the poorest households on less than £20,000 or euros a year, actually pay any frequent flyer charge, compared with 63% of households amongst the wealthiest on over 100,000 per year. That's the kind of overview of the levy itself. But what we wanted to do was to go beyond just the sort of theoretical design of the levy and start thinking about how it can actually be practically implemented. What are the challenges? We've been pushing this policy for 10 years in the UK, and it gets very broad public support. Most politicians like it, but a lot of people say, oh, it's too complicated. You couldn't do it. It's too complicated. So, nice idea, but not going to happen. And we don't think that's true. So we commissioned a legal study to try and help us assess what the hurdles might actually be. Our assessment of that legal study is that it is possible at an EU level or a European level, and it is possible nationally, i.e. it doesn't have to be done by every country. But of course, it's easier for a country like the UK, which is an island nation with borders that are sort of harder to cross on by land than it would be, say, in Belgium, where there's very easy access to neighboring countries. So in those countries with very close neighboring airports, ideally you would want your neighbors to all be part of the same scheme. But it can be done, for example, by a group of nations. To do it at the EU level, though, there's some key issues that we would need to be addressed. And I think broadly speaking, the two key ones are the issue of proportionality and unanimity. And I'll come back to them in a second. But where we think this policy is strong is that fundamentally the EU at an international level endorses the principle that the polluter should pay. And in the aviation sector, they currently do not pay. And one of the key reasons that we think that the FFL could be considered a viable policy for the European Union is that it qualifies as an environmental tax, which is a category of tax that the EU is empowered to take action on. But also the second reason is that the other thing that the EU has a mandate to lead on is sort of harmonization of taxes and particularly cross-border taxes in Europe. And this is often framed as maintaining the single market or the integrity of the single market in Europe, managing an economy which has open movement between borders and things requires some taxes to be managed at the EU level. And we would argue that air passenger taxes are in that category and probably should already be managed at that level to avoid inconsistent policies between countries. But coming back to those two issues around sort of unanimity and proportionality. So on the issue of unanimity, in order to pass a tax in the a tax at the EU level, under current legislation in the EU, it does require all countries to buy in. So you require every nation in the EU to essentially agree that the tax is acceptable and it can be passed. And of course, we know that getting agreement from such a large block of countries is just fundamentally challenging. That applies to any tax and could be said of any progressive tax that we want to see in Europe, but it is just a simple reality. And then we come on to the issue with data privacy, which is something that's often talked about with the frequent flyer levy as well, another sort of area of pushback that we see. So to some extent, to manage a frequent flying levy, you would need to track the movements of residents of European nations. As it happens, we already track the movements of European nations across borders. That's fairly standard protocol for security reasons, for immigration reasons, and other. But what we would need in this instance is a strong justification as to why it was acceptable. And this is where I come back to that point about proportionality, why it would be acceptable to introduce another form of tracking of movements on European residents. So we need to establish that the social benefit of doing the frequent flyer levy is so strong, and we would argue that it is, to justify, for example, a new database. And that database actually doesn't have to track very much information at all. It just needs to know who the individual is and how many times they've flown in a given annual 12-month period. But of course, the EU at a governance level would need to establish that it was a priority. We talked a lot internally and with our legal consultants about different ways of designing how you track individuals or how you identify them in the system. Obviously, a key challenge being that people in the EU sometimes travel with a passport and they sometimes travel with an identity card. We, as a result, think that the easiest way to deal with this would be that every passenger or every European resident would need to be assigned a passenger number. And that system is actually a system that's already in operation in some countries. For example, the majority of the United States of America's residents have a flyer identification number. So such systems do already exist for other purposes and could be implemented here. There was one other alternative way of doing this that requires less identification of individuals at the point of ticket purchase. The legal experts did raise the other possibility of taxing an individual on their tax return at the end of the year in a sort of self-declaration system where you declare, I flew 3 times this year, therefore you pay a certain tax. It is a way of doing it and could be considered as an option, but we think it's less ideal because it doesn't present the true cost of flying at the point of making the purchase when you buy your ticket. And that does link into one of a key consideration for the policy. It would be important that people could see and would be aligned with EU laws that people can see when they purchase the ticket exactly how much they're going to have to pay. So you would need a system by which when you go through the purchase process of buying a ticket, you get that feedback on and you're told how much you're going to be needing to pay at the end. For the purposes of checking flight prices up front rather than purchasing, probably individuals could actually just declare themselves how many times they've flown in a given year. We don't think that would be unreasonable to ask. As I mentioned, there are some precedents in policy for doing this type of thing. Back in 2005, a collection of 9 countries collectively implemented what they called at the time a solidarity tax. It was essentially the first air departure tax. It was led by France in particular, and that policy has changed greatly today and just, in fact, very recently been changed again. But when it was first created, it set a useful precedent that multiple countries could come together and could create, outside of the UN and outside of the EU, a tax policy. The carbon border adjustment mechanism in the EU was long considered to be incredibly complicated, and yet it has now been done. As I mentioned, in the USA, they already track and operate flyer numbers. And also, we thought it important to note here that in 2019, the EU Commission did look at aviation tax policies and essentially concluded that there would not actually be a negative economic impact of doing this, meaning that there is a sort of robust economic justification for the policies, we think. Finally, and I won't take long on this because I'm talking too much already, just on the use of revenues. A very significant amount of money could be raised by a frequent flyer levy, an additional sum of around 64 billion across Europe, including countries that are not part of the European Union. Within the European Union, there would be enough revenue raising potential to create a sum equivalent to 30% of the entire EU budget, very significant amount of money. As well as we estimate around 24% of the amount of money that is needed currently and urgently for the EU to meet its own climate targets. So it was estimated that around 260 billion pounds of euros of investment per year is required for Europe to meet its climate targets. But currently within what's called fiscal rules, the rules that govern how much the EU can invest and EU countries can invest, it's going to be very, very difficult to actually invest that amount of money. And so we're proposing here one way that revenue could be raised to help do that. You can see there the figures within the EU and outside the EU, 63 billion outside overall of Europe and 50 billion within the EU. And we think it's vital that this money is used to finance the just transition, supporting workers, including some in carbon-intensive industries, potentially even in the aviation industry with the transition, but of course also in the alternatives, in the rail infrastructure that's needed, and potentially, of course, also in supporting those areas that are highly tourism dependent and could experience some negative impacts as a result of a reduction in flying. The revenue raised should be more than enough to support those areas to create new sustainable economies. We also think it's important that a large chunk of this revenue is used to essentially compensate the global south particularly, but other countries, lower income countries that are going to be worst affected by the climate crisis, to pay for their losses and damage, which are primarily as a result of our, as in developed nations' actions over the last 100 years or so. We don't think that these revenues should be used to finance the technological solutions of the aviation industry itself. They have plenty of their own revenues and very significant profit margins in most cases. They can pay for that themselves, and it is only fair and just that they do so given the damage that they're doing to the climate. That's my long ramble over. Hopefully I didn't send too many people to sleep. I think we can start, well, we're going to be on to questions and discussion, but I think we're going to hear from Javier first, aren't we, Lena?
Yes, exactly. So, yes, welcome, Javier. Maybe we can, we don't need the PowerPoint right now. Javier, thanks for joining us. You're professor at the University of Vigo. You've a lot of experience in terms of taxes and energy and in Spain and internationally. So we would be very interested in your opinion on the frequent flying levy. What do you think, like in the wider economic context? Do you think it makes sense? And do you think it is something feasible? How could it be implemented? And you can speak in Spanish if you want, and we
As you
will.
wish. I can speak in English or in Spanish. What is better for you?
I mean, I think most people here understand English, so maybe if it's okay for you, if it doesn't matter, then it can also be in English.
It is
Yeah.
fine. I will speak in English. I also prefer it. But as there
Okay.
are so many
Perfect.
translators, etc., I wanted to ask first.
Yes. Thank
Thanks.
you.
I mean, it's a pleasure for me to be here. Thanks to Pablo for inviting me to join, and I won't be long because I had some information on your work, and I already interacted with Pablo, and basically he gave me the initial contents of your work, and I agree with what you say. Well, what I can say on this, I mean, I think that aviation is a huge problem for us with the current technologies, taxation is a good tool in general for many environmental problems, but particularly in taxation in aviation. And I like the presentation, and I think the idea. I mean, the overall idea is quite smart in the sense that when we have environmental taxes or any other type of policies, we are in environmental areas. We are mainly interested in two issues, right? First of all, that they work from an environmental point of view. I think this is crucial. Otherwise, we are talking about other revenue raising policies or social policies if we want to reduce equity, but I mean we are talking about usually when we discuss environmental policies or environmental taxes, instruments to reduce the environmental impacts, and it seems that in this case the results prove that they are able to reduce emissions, and I think this is quite important. But of course, these instruments also have very important impacts that need to be accounted for. One of them is the equity issue. I mean, who pay for these instruments? and how we can compensate, those low-income people or those people with less economic capacity. And then another issue is the competitiveness issue, which I think is important. You also discussed it, but I think it's something that we have to take into account. I will tell you something about Spain later regarding that. So I think that the proposal is good in the sense that it targets one major environmental problem or environmental sector. A major a sector which creates a huge problem for the environment, and does it both taking into account the effectiveness and the equity. I have some doubts on the feasibility. Before Alex was talking about this, I was working on other areas, and particularly in road taxation, for instance. Most academics know that the current types of fuel taxes, car taxes are not very good. They are not very effective, and probably we need to go for a different approach in taxation, I mean. And particularly the real usage of vehicles, which raises a lot of similar issues to the ones presented by Alex. And of course, in many countries, they were pre-tested, or this kind of charges based on the use of cars, on the real use of cars. There was a lot of resistance by people, saying that they were against privacy, etc. So this is an issue which you have to take into account. Second issue is that, for me, perhaps we can discuss it in another moment, Alex. But for me, then the amount of revenues is huge with regard to the reduction of emissions. So that makes me a bit nervous, in the sense that you really want to reduce emissions, not say huge cost, but this is something more technical. Let me tell you a bit about my involvement in the Spanish Tax Reform Committee, because I think it may shed some light on some of the issues you may want to discuss later. So basically, the Spanish government created in 21 a committee by academics, 15 academics, 2/3 public economists, public and environmental economists, and 1/3 were lawyers. And this report was quite important because it was part of the Spanish agreement with the European Commission to do reforms in terms of all this money coming from the post-COVID kind of public programs for recovery, just to compensate the losses, and also to transform the economy, more greener economy, etc. So Spain was the second country receiving these funds after Italy, and this was quite an important issue. So we were working under a lot of pressure, because we knew what we were writing was important. But unfortunately, when we presented the report, which was in 22, the Russians had invaded Ukraine the week before. So basically, the Spanish government said there is no way to do any tax reform at the moment, and especially no tax reform regarding energy or transportation or things like that, given so unfortunately, what I'm going to tell you briefly is in the shelf at the moment. What we did is, the Spanish government asked us to work in several areas, like corporate taxation, wealth taxation, and other things. But one area was environmental taxation, and I was the expert in the group, together with a lawyer. So basically, we did a comprehensive set of proposals. I would say the core of the report was transportation, and there we had aviation as well. But there were other issues like waste and water taxation and electrification, things like that, right? Regarding aviation, we had this double proposal: one on the kerosene tax to reduce, to improve technologies and to put costs fine. I mean, this is ridiculous that the sector which is so damaging is the only one basically in Europe which is not paying energy taxation. And then we also proposed a ticket tax in Spain to kill demand or to reduce demand. I mean, just both things together. So we did simulations both for these two taxes, and in this report we were very keen on, or we were emphasizing a lot the distributional part. I mean, we wanted all the proposals to check the distributional effects, and I have to tell you that you know, many environmental taxes are regressive. I mean, they are paid more by people with less money. And also transport taxes, but this was basically the only exception. I mean, this is a progressive tax, without, I mean, just a general, not a frequent flyer. I mean, just a general kerosene and a ticket tax is progressive. So this issue is less worrying here than in other taxes, right? I want this I want to make clear this for you. I mean, and we did a lot of analysis for transport taxes, for electricity taxation, for waste taxation, and most of them are regressive or proportional. This one was progressive for the case of Spain. So basically, what we did in the report, and that's something to discuss as well, was to compensate for those regressive taxes through the revenues. So basically, just taking only the first deciles that Alex showed us before, giving back to these people the money, right? And we could make many environmental taxes which were not very good from a distributional, socio-economic point of view, a kind of much more interesting, and this is good also to reduce barriers to implementation of these taxes, because you know, maybe many people think that these taxes are bad because they charge the poor more than, and we could demonstrate that this not necessarily is the case if you apply the compensatory devices that we proposed. Of course, then the European governments did the contrary, the opposite. They just subsidized energy, etc., which was, I mean, a huge mistake, and particularly in Spain. So I could say that comparing what you found with this, I mean, I think that, and Alex was mentioning, okay, if we had other taxes in place, perhaps you know, these proposals could be you know, changed, or we could do you know, different simulations. But if there are other taxes in place, like a full kerosene tax or a proper ticket tax, I want you to take this into account, because perhaps the effectiveness of these other taxes are big, and the distributional effects are not so bad. So perhaps we need a kind of a complement to these general taxes for this frequent flyer, because if this is a problem, it's not bad, but perhaps it's just a surcharge or something like that, not the very center of the scheme, right? And finally, let me finish telling you a bit about the competitiveness, because the tax reform, the White Book was well received in general by policymakers, by the different political parties in Spain, by society, but there were a few lobbies that were really against it, and particularly against the environmental part. I mean, nobody talked about the wealth taxation or corporate taxation, but you know, the big lobbies against the White Book were transport, you know, the car makers, road people, blah, 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 and the aviation. So you have to take this into account, because they are really powerful, and they can do, you know, a lot of work against this proposal, and they did against ours, which was a very, you know, the simulation was very low, and we were taking, you know, very low ticket taxes already existing in other European countries to simulate, but they basically created a kind of a lobby together with the tourism sector. And after a few months, after, in late 22, they did this big event in Madrid, saying that, we would basically create a lot of problems for the Spanish economy, a lot of unemployment. The tourism sector would be really affected with a very, very low ticket tax. I mean, we were simulating €7 per ticket. I mean, really, really, and the simulations were not, telling the politicians what to do, just an illustration for the policymakers after our proposals. And I finish here. Thanks. I hope I was, I could give some ideas for the further debate, etc.
Yes, thanks a lot, Javier. This was interesting, and I totally agree with you that in general, as aviation is such an elitist form of transport, mostly, not the whole time, but mostly, it is kind of already proportional or progressive to have a tax on kerosene or on VAT or flight tickets. It is definitely not proportional to subsidize aviation that much. Still, yes, we do face a lot of industry opposition for any kind of taxes, or even if it's very minor increases. Yes, we do see this problem a lot. I don't know if Alex, if you still want to reply to the comment from Javier, or if you should right away open up the discussion for further questions.
Very briefly, but yeah, I mean, thanks for the comments. It was really useful. Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that, I mean, you're definitely right about the point that aviation taxes are just progressively distributed across the population, regardless of whether there's a frequent flyer levy or not. And I suppose the objective of the frequent flyer levy is not so much to correct the sort of distributional design of it, but it is very much a communication tool, a sort of sociological tool as much as anything else, because I mean, it might be different in other countries. I'm coming at this very from a UK perspective, but there is a really, really strong sort of socio-cultural position that you have, I may not agree, but many people would say that you have a right to a family holiday by plane every year, no matter what your income is. And I suppose as an island nation, maybe the UK has a slightly stronger claim to that, but I'm sure many wouldn't agree. But nonetheless, the communication tool that we have, or the communication that we narrative we have with the public, is going to be really important to the green transition. And taking examples like the Yellow Vests French protests against fuel duty, or the recent sort of protests by farmers, although we can debate about how legitimate those were, but nonetheless, some of the protests were legitimate. That there is a real feeling that amongst a decent chunk of society, that politicians are getting the sequencing wrong of the green transition. They're coming after the everyday working person or family or individual before they've dealt with the really sort of extreme, completely unreasonable levels of pollution. And so my feeling is that, you have to deal with the optics and the communication tool before you're ever going to have the social license to do the sort of broader changes that you're talking about there with the broader tax system. So I agree. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, because the UK has just increased air passenger duty very slightly, not a lot, but they have. They were willing to do that. So maybe they would be willing to do this. But I have concerns that they would get quite a strong pushback from the public if there wasn't a very, very obvious narrative about the fairness being baked into the policy. And that's what the frequent flyer levy does. But yeah, and it'd be great to get into some of the other more detailed points later on, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, just also adding one thought. I think it is interesting, this idea of distributing the revenues to the people individually, like compensations or giving back money, so that, because this would maybe also be a social license for environmental measures. And we debated this a bit also in our discussions around the revenues with the organization Equal Rights, who also has like a proposal for how to reduce fossil fuels and how to use the revenues from that. So I see pro arguments and counter arguments, but I'm also happy to now hear from the audience what your opinion is. I already saw two messages in the chat, which are really interesting. Thanks a lot for that, Stephanie. I think those are very important questions, like what would be next steps to get closer to the implementation. I think I would maybe first still wait if there are any questions for content before we go into the implementation part. And I also saw that Santiago had a comment on the like EU level versus member state level. I agree that there are a lot of arguments in favor of implementing this on the EU level, but we do know that until unanimity is necessary for tax topics, it will be very hard. So we either need to change this unanimity decision, and it is debated, I think, or we start with some country level and bilateral agreements. And I also saw that Clive Spash is part of the audience, and Clive Spash is a social ecological economist, professor at Economic University of Vienna. So I also just thought maybe it's interesting to also get a comment from you. What do you think about the proposal? Do you have any questions or thoughts on it?
Yeah, sure. I could say something. You can hear me okay? Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, I think there is the concern about the complexity. I guess this is one of the issues, and I always like more simple taxes in a way, or simple instruments. But at the same time, I think even just campaigning for the tax for me is important, because it's the idea is to create debate, I think, as well in society about this. So even if it's not successful, I think it's a necessary debate to have. The thing that with the unanimity, I did think about that as well, because I studied emissions trading. And why did that get in? So the Commission wanted a tax on carbon. They did not want an emissions trading scheme. They tried 3 or 4 times, and then they realized that emissions trading fell under as an environmental regulation, not as a economic instrument, which meant that it didn't need unanimity. So they got the emissions trading through the back door because it didn't actually come down as a tax. So that was one of the issues. I think the chances of changing this law, I think this would be, that's not going to happen. You're not going to get rid of unanimity. And it'll be a waste of energy. So I think for me, getting the debate and discussion going on this is actually in itself a successful campaigning process, The complexities have all been discussed. I think you have some good economists on board who've discussed everything. The NEF have discussed it. The details are all there, and there's nothing for me to add to what's already been said. I think it's all very professional and being done very well, So, yeah.
Thanks a lot, Clive. Are there any further questions, comments? Please just raise your hand, speak out. I'm also invite you to switch on your cameras, because it's so much nicer to see some faces in the discussion. Alex, you still wanted to say something?
I will do if I can. If other people want to, they can come in. So Thanks, Clive, for the comments. I mean, I completely agree that the there is a strategic reason to push for the FFL, even if we reach a point where we feel like it is going to be difficult to secure for whatever reason, as you say, to raise the issue, put it on the agenda. And because we know that with the type of politicians that we have, if you know, if you give them a stretch goal, maybe you might get half of what you wanted. And right now, in the middle of a climate crisis, we can't really sniff at anything. So I agree. And if I think about what might be the type of thing that in the short term, while we wait for the full perfect frequent flyer levy that we might be able to get, the two things that jump to my mind is, first of all, obviously we need some form of kerosene tax or a more aggressive departure tax. But you could just do, for example, in the UK we have what's called a rail card or a bus card, which gives people a discount for various social reasons. If you're a student, you get a student card. If you're disabled, you get a disabled card, and that gives you a discount. Actually, there's no reason why you couldn't do that for flying. So you can make flying much more expensive just for the basic level of ticket. And then you could say, right, we're going to give a discount card. Maybe everyone in the population, the first flight they do is discounted, or maybe all the people who have a social reason, or maybe all the migrant workers, or whatever. That's, to me, seems like reasonable. But you get that, I think, partly by campaigning for the full frequent flyer levy and pulling the politicians to where you want them to be. Equally, I think, Javier, you talked about the idea of, sort of compensatory taxes. Maybe there's another way of just putting something on the really, really egregious frequent flyers, the people who are flying 12 times a year. Maybe there's a clever way, for example, through the tax return at the end of the year, you put a charge on your tax return for everyone who flies more than 10 times or something. So there's these types of like halfway houses that would be I think, a positive step nonetheless. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Thanks, Alex. I see Ruth. Do you want to speak?
Yes, please. Somebody said that it was more difficult for people in Britain to avoid flying if they want to go on holiday in Europe. That's not true. There's the Channel Tunnel. There are cross-channel ferries. It's perfectly possible to go into Europe without flying, and it's probably cheaper, though I haven't investigated because I can't afford to go either way.
Yes, you're right. I think most of us have done this trip via the channel, probably channel. I don't know if the amount of travel would be possible via the channel if no flights were happening anymore, but that's another topic maybe.
I think John has his hand up.
John, yes.
Yeah, thank you. John Stewart knows more about this than I do, I'm sure, and I'm a bit out of date, but is it not the case in the UK that airlines actually offer a frequent flyer discount? And so if that is the case, and leaving aside the kind of legal economic stuff, would it not be a sort of good place to start to campaign to remove that as a first stage, and then as a second stage, impose additional costs on frequent flyers? Because at the moment, they're getting discounts for flying all the time. So just on that, but it may not be the case anymore. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right, John. The frequent flyer programs do effectively discount more frequent travel. So I think there are campaign groups calling for either a tax on those schemes, the air miles type schemes, or just to abolish them entirely. I personally think that the overall sort of effect it would have on emissions would be pretty small. But I think from a symbolic communications point of view, probably it's very rational. Catherine?
Been through the Channel Tunnel 6 times this year. I would like a frequent train travel thing as part of if you start being cross about flying, then start being very promoting of the trains, and they're getting better in Europe all the time.
Couldn't agree more.
Yes, thanks. Finley.
Thank you. I was just thinking about the point at which you apply. So you have your like unique passenger number. You were talking about applying the price like at the point the customer is just searching for flights. And I suppose, well, I'm just wondering if you've had discussions when you're doing the study about um when to present the pricing information to the person, because obviously at the moment you could go on a search comparison site and you don't enter any details, and basically until you get to like the purchase page for your flights. So this would require you like just in order to search flights. But I'm just thinking, to be honest, when I've thought about it, I've thought it would more be applied when you come to purchase it, because you have to input personal details at that point anyway. So I'm just wondering if you had that discussion and why you are thinking what you're thinking.
We did. I think the answer to that was essentially that the way we viewed it is that if you have a database that is counting the residents' number of flights per year, then you would only be accessing information from that database at the point when you actually purchase the ticket. So your airline would go to the database, check that how many flights you've done, and give you the final purchase price during the purchase process. But from the purposes of searching and just checking prices, if you think about the search box on Skyscanner or one of those websites, all you would need to do is just put another box there that says how many times have you flown in the last 12 months. You put your own number in, say 4, and it gives you the price based on the number that you've given. And obviously it only checks that you've actually not lied about that number when you go through the actual final purchase process.
Charlene?
Yeah, I wanted to speak just to be able to read maybe the question that Wim asked in French in the chat. So the question is about basically the politicians and what their vision is and why they are always pushing for the growth of aviation, and apparently like connected to the job argument. And like that Wim tells us that it seems that this message from the authorities has actually an impact on the people wanting to fly. And another question in that same message is more about the low cost. So wouldn't it be interesting to fight against the low cost, because it's actually also pushing the growth? And how is it connected to the frequent flying levy? Is it integrated or not within this? Because in fact, the low cost provokes the fact that more and more people are able to afford flying, whereas they were not at the beginning. I hope I didn't translate too bad your question, Wim.
Thanks, Charlene. There was also I think another comment in French. I don't know if that's...
Yeah, so it's about the yeah, so it's just about the cost, like what the taxation would bring as revenues. We could also add to this amount all the avoided costs, like for instance all the health problems that are provoked by aviation, and that would be spared with this diminution of the aviation sector.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, if you want to, I'm always a bit hesitant on putting euro numbers on things like health or lives of people. I think it's basically not possible to do that, and it's also, yeah, it sometimes can help with communication, but it also can be counterproductive and morally problematic. But I totally agree that this is just the number of tax income, but of course, with this money, a lot of good things can be done and a lot of bad things can be avoided by reducing aviation. And this has to be stressed, either putting it in numbers or just saying it. I don't know, Alex, did you also still want to answer on something? And then I have still Clive on the list.
So just very briefly on the political economy of all this, obviously the aviation industry are extremely powerful lobbyists. I mean, there's very little really separating their lobbying operation from the the lobbying of the fossil fuel industries, which gets much more coverage, but it's pretty similar, really. In fact, the majority of the money spent in aviation goes on directly on kerosene purchases on fossil fuels. So, you know, with that lobbying power, they have convinced many, not just politicians, elected politicians, but civil servants of the importance of the sector. And maybe 10 to 20 years ago, there was some truth to what they were saying when the numbers of passengers traveling for business were much higher. You know, you can see in the economic data some connection between business purposes travel and economic growth in the purest sense. But now with the rise of digital communication, as we're all doing right now, the benefits of that type of connectivity is really declining, and we're not actually seeing really any growth at all in business passenger numbers. Where the growth is all in the mass tourism model. Now, for a country like the UK, sending more and more people to southern Spain really isn't doing anything for our economy. I think that's very hard to argue, and that we need a change of thinking in the UK. But I am interested in the views of Javier or Pablo in terms of how the economic benefits of incoming tourism are seen in Spain, because at least from a foreign position, it doesn't seem like the people of Spain are particularly happy about those benefits right now, but there must be something in it. So I'm interested in that kind of commentary.
I don't know, Javier, do you first want to answer, and then I'm not sure, Clive, if it's a new argument or if it's also on this aspect.
Well, indeed, there is a debate on the problems of tourism in Spain, in many Spanish cities, because you know, the impacts on housing and on other quality of life in general.
Yeah.
But the industry is so powerful. I mean, as I told you before, they did this event and they were giving numbers which were completely unbelievable in terms of reduction of jobs in Spain for people working in these industries, and affecting a lot the Spanish GDP. So you know, I mean, there is this double debate here. On the one hand, some people are really fed up with mass tourism, and on the other way, on the other hand, there are many jobs that depend from this sector. So it has to be handled properly. I think that probably the best approach is to say, yeah, I mean, we want tourism, but not mass tourism. I mean, we want just high quality tourism with less, demand of all these environmental disasters in terms of emissions, etc.
Thanks, Clive.
Yeah, I mean, I could just comment on the tourism issue as well, but you know, a lot of the money that goes in, it does not end up in the countries. It depends on how the schemes are run. I mean, a lot of people who are flying, you know, they go to a tourist resort, the money is kept internal to the tourist resort and taken out again. It doesn't actually go into the country, very little of it. There's an awful lot of rubbish talked about jobs and job creation. And I know for people in Barcelona, you know, they were trying to get rid of a lot of tourism because it actually ruins the city and the city life. You've got drunken British people flying in, you know, and the same in Hungary. It's awful, like, you know, these stag parties and God knows what going on, and ruining people's communities, right? So Airbnb is inculpable in all of this. People renting out their houses next door to families who are trying to get their children to bed, and they've got drunken people there, you know, every day of the week. This is all flying in on cheap flights. So I think there's real issues there about tourism and the rubbish that is talked about it creating jobs and what goes on could be, you know, deconstructed as well. But I wanted to mention, the first thing was about cost benefit analysis, and then trying to put, you know, I wrote a book on cost benefit 30 years ago. I worked on environment and valuation, and I would definitely not go down that route. You know, it's not a good way to go. You end up with equating the value of life and various other things to money. And this ends up just a fight over money numbers, and you don't get what you want. And you can't calculate these things with any meaning anyway. So you're much better off saying, look, there's a lot of harm created this. We need to stop this activity. We create something that sends us incentive mechanism, which is what you're trying to do with this levy and other taxes. And that's the best way to go. But of course, stay grounded is operative on many levels. So, you've got other policies. And I think one of the big things with flying is that the price it's got nothing to do with the cost of flying. It's actually very heavily supported by property development. There's all sorts of infrastructure that goes into it. If I look at the building of an extension of or a new airport, all the infrastructure is paid for by government, the roads, the railway links, all that kind of stuff, And then they get land for free, and then they do property development on site, and they say shopping malls and so on and so forth. And that's how you explain that the price of the ticket is basically zero, because it's not about flying anymore. It's actually about creating a whole infrastructure industry that is making money off of property and sales. And, they make the airport so big that you have to walk half a mile to get to your airplane through tons of shops. This is not an accident. This is a deliberate marketing device to get people to buy stuff before they actually get on the plane. So it's the whole industry, I think.
A lot
Yes,
of that stuff
thanks
isn't
for
taxed.
drawing. Yeah, some of it. There was still a question in the comments on private jets and how this relates to the FFL. Just saying that we did not include private jets into our calculations because basically we don't want private jets to still exist. So we would like to ban private jets. And of course, like in case it wasn't banned, then the levy on private jet flights should be a lot higher than the rest. But we definitely prefer bans here. And just mentioning that we have that the time is almost over from the originally planned timing, but I see that there's still some more questions, and I would like to still take them and maybe just take 5 minutes longer, if that's okay. So Charlene and then Pablo.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to add a small input about the French situation. Telling you that actually, so maybe some of you have seen, because I think there are French people in the room, I've seen that we are campaigning not for the FFL for the moment, but for an increase on the domestic tax, so the tax, the normal ticket tax, and we have launched a petition together with the French influencer Camille Etienne, and with the Réseau Action Climat, because we think that this is a win that we could achieve within the budget discussion this year, whereas the FFL would really mean take a lot longer. But that doesn't mean that we think that it's a bad idea. Of course, we think that an FFL would be better, but in an ideal world, and for the moment, we don't really have the capacity to push for it in the budget right now. And I also wanted to point out to everyone in the room that the RAC, so the Réseau Action Climat in France, issued a report that is quite interesting because it it compares different measures about the growth of aviation. So there is the FFL, there is also capping airports, there is the increase on ticket tax, and actually the most efficient, the just, and also which raises a lot of money is the FFL. So I'm just putting the link to this report. I don't think it exists in English and in Spanish, but I think it's interesting to see that the figures are quite interesting in France, and probably it would be the same in comparable countries. That's it for me. Thanks.
Thank you, Charlene. Pablo?
Yeah, thank you, Elena. Yeah, just a quick word on the tourism thing. And not to forget the economy of the airport managers, which is dependent as well on the number of flights and arrivals. Just to mention an example, for example, in Spain, the Spanish airport manager, which is called AENA, in 2023, they made about 40% of the total income of the airport on commercial shops and parkings and so on. So as Clive was saying, I mean, expanding airports, expanding the number of international tourists arrivals are directly in line of expanding the private companies' businesses. So it's a matter of economy as well for them. So this is like one of the main reasons, because in Spain there are like 13 airport expansions planned for the next 4 or 5 years. So we just this quick note to not to forget the economy of the airport manager structures, which are often owned by private companies.
Yes, exactly. Yes. So growth of aviation is really picking up. Lots of airports, not only in Spain, trying to be expanded, and Stay Grounded is also doing like working on this airport level and on the topic of capping flights. Apart from the FFL, I really want to thank you all for participating here, and also for bringing in some new ideas. I'm taking with me to maybe think about if the FFL proposal could also be combined with the idea of giving back money to people, like compensations. Thinking about the social discount card for flying, Alex was mentioning. Maybe also if it could be a good step first to campaign against frequent flyer programs, those Miles and More programs. And also Stephanie had put in a good idea, which would be to maybe move towards a voluntary FFL scheme in the meantime, like to basically convince rich flyers that they should pay something, I don't know, I don't know where, to the government or to a certain pot, and the money could be used in a useful way. So I think those are very interesting ideas. And Stephanie's question was also, what would be next steps and what could we do best to help? So I think it would be great to talk about this. We have a social media package online. I will also send it to all people who joined this call. I'm happy if you can forward stuff. You can also invite us to hold a workshop at your, I don't know, your constituency. And I think, yeah, let's get this into discussions. We are discussing the potential for a follow-up campaign. We will definitely continue working on this. And if you have any further ideas, also very happy to be in touch with you. Yes. So I don't know, Alex, if you also want to say some last words, and I don't know if Javier, you also want to say something.
Thank you for having me.
It was a pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Yes, same. Thank you to all of you, and have a good evening.
Bye.
Bye.